why do we say there's no such thing as safe protesting? You, as an individual participating in a protest, may have every intention of doing so in a safe fashion. You may intend that all of the protests that you will participate in will be peaceful, and that you will remain peaceful. The organizers of any protest that you attend may intend for that protest to be peaceful. There are people in power who can just decide that a protest is no longer going to be peaceful. They can send in forces that will increase the violence of a protest with few to no repercussions for them. And of course, there are also counter-agents. To whatever issue you might be protesting, there might be someone on the other side of it, and they can show up and make a protest violent as well. We teach a course on safe-ish protesting for these reasons, which we teach in a risk-aware, informed fashion, rather than promising that there is any magical techniques that will keep you safe all the time at any protest, because there aren't. Now, before I get into this content, I want to point you in the direction of some resources. It may take me a while to get this course in its entirety up on YouTube. We have very few volunteers, all of them do this work for free, and we are all strapped for time and energy. We are all stretched a little thin. We taught this as a live seminar for a mutual aid center in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the recording of that live seminar, which covers all of the information, is up on our Patreon at patreon.com/Sanctum of the Craft, and it can be watched there. If you do not have time to wait for the videos to come out in pieces here on YouTube, the entirety of it is recorded live and available for anyone who wants to make use of it. We also have a downloadable ebook and PDF version of this information, which is again up free and public on our Patreon at patreon.com/Sanctum of the Craft. There is also a print version of the booklet that is available. It's rather thick. Unfortunately for these, we do have to ask that people cover the printing and shipping cost. The shipping cost is about $5. The printing cost is about $7. So these booklets end up being about $12. And you can order those via email. You can email us at staff@sanctumofthecraft.org. Again, that's staff@sanctumofthecraft.org. And we can arrange to ship the booklets to you. Legalities of protesting. Public protests have played critical and pivotal roles in the history of American social justice. We teach multiple classes on the history of activism, including the history of herbalism as activism and the history of street, protest, riot, and action medicine, so I will not belabor this point at this time. It is important to understand the right to protest and both its broad protections and narrow limitations. The government does have the ability to restrict protests under certain circumstances. Whether or not it should have that right is something to be debated at another time. The First Amendment states, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Although the First Amendment does not explicitly refer to protests, courts have repeatedly held that the First Amendment's protection of free expression encompasses the right to protest through the constitutionally protected rights of free speech, peaceable assembly, and petitioning the government for change. The right to freedom of speech grants protesters the rights to express their opinions on public property, including with speeches, signs and banners, and symbolic acts. Courts have made exceptions that this speech and these acts cannot contain true threats, expressing the intent to commit an act of unlawful violence to a particular person or group, and incitement, speech directed at producing imminent lawless action that is likely to produce it. That doesn't mean that a protest can never mention or advocate for violence. Free speech can express philosophical support for violence, general endorsement of it, or even assert a moral propriety and moral necessity for violence. Freedom of speech protects hateful, insulting, and offensive speech as well. The right to peaceable assembly grants protesters the right to gather in groups to protest at demonstrations, rallies, and marches. The right to petition the government means those protests can include requests and demands that the government address injustice or change legislation. Recently, threats have been made to withdraw federal funding from any college, school, or university that allows illegal protests. Agitators have also been threatened with imprisonment and deportation without trial, but agitator is not a legal term, and agitation is a form of free speech. But there is no such thing as an illegal protest. Law enforcement can't declare an assembly unlawful without an exceptionally strong reason to do so. The First Amendment prohibits law enforcement from declaring an assembly unlawful because of the assembly's message. Any attempt to shut down a protest because of its message would bluntly and blatantly violate freedom of speech. So where is speech protected? How much protection a protest has under free speech depends on its location and on what type of forum a location is. The Supreme Court has recognized spaces such as sidewalks and parks as areas that have been used immemorially for public expression, and the government's authority to regulate speech in those areas is sharply circumscribed. Immemorially refers to things that originate in the past or are very old, so this refers to traditional use. Locations that are not traditionally used for free expression can still be designated a space of public forum and have the same First Amendment protections as those that have been used immemorially. However, any space that is designated as this can lose that designation, but while it has the same protections as speech in a public park or on a sidewalk. There are also limited public forums, which are opened for a particular purpose rather than for all free speech expression. The government can limit expression in a limited public forum to a particular group or to particular topics, such as when a town council allows public comments related to council or town business and policies. The government is not permitted to engage in viewpoint discrimination, where it attempts to regulate what opinions the speakers can express. The First Amendment protects speech in a limited public forum so long as the protester belongs to the class of people for whom the forum exists, and the focus of their speech is within the topics for which the forum was opened. There are also non-public forums, which are public properties that have not been immemorially used for free speech or designated as open for public expression. Examples include polling places, travel terminals, and military bases. The government cannot restrict all free speech in those areas. For example, it cannot prohibit a traveler from expressing an opinion with what their t-shirt or a pin on their jacket says. However, they can prohibit large rallies. All restrictions are legally required to be reasonable and viewpoint neutral. On private property, the government has no right to restrict a person's speech on their own property, but grants no protections to the right to protest on someone else's private property without their consent. So are all kinds of protests protected in a traditional public forum? No, there are restrictions and regulations that the government can put in place. These are generally time, place, and manner restrictions. They are only valid if they can be justified without reference to the speech's content. They have to be specific to significant government interests, including traffic safety or residential privacy. For example, the government can restrict people from having a march in a residential neighborhood at 3 o'clock in the morning. Any restrictions have to leave open alternative channels for communication of the idea, such as asking that the protest take place during the day. There are legal arguments to be made that any restriction requiring that free speech in a public forum be restricted by time, place, and manner is not constitutional, but courts so far have found that these restrictions are acceptable. So, do you need a permit? The answer is sometimes. For large protests that require street closures or take over a public park, the government can require notification or permits, but any requirements have to be based on the government's actual needs and have clear, objective, and content-neutral standards. The government cannot treat protests differently based on the views that they are expressing. The notice period cannot be excessively long and must allow for spontaneous protest in response to recent news and events. Marches on the sidewalks generally do not require permits, so long as marchers do not obstruct car or pedestrian traffic. However, if the march requires blocking traffic or a street closure, if it is going to gather at a park or plaza and take over a lot of it, or if it requires the use of sound amplifying devices, then a permit may be needed. The route of a march cannot be restricted unless it is necessary for traffic or public safety, and if the protest cannot afford to pay the fee for the permit, they should allow a waiver for those who cannot afford it. Courts have found that requiring individuals or small groups to apply for a notice or permit is unconstitutional, so long as the protest is in a traditional public forum. Why to maybe not get a permit? In recent months, some protest groups have obtained permits from the NYPD for demonstrations. Here are some reasons why obtaining permission and permits from the police for protests might be counterproductive or even dangerous. Requiring permits at all violates our First Amendment rights, and we ideally should not be complicit in that violation. Requesting permission from the apparatus of oppression to protest that oppression is counterintuitive. Protests are meant to be disruptive, and disruptive protests are effective. Working with the government and/or the police doesn't disrupt the current system, it legitimizes it. Permitted routes and locations are restricted routes and locations. They stifle the ability of the protest to be flexible and grow. When police know the route and location of every part of a protest, it is easier for them to set up counterweapons and surveillance technology to block access and to kettle the protesters. Permits may create an unsafe environment for undocumented people as law enforcement cooperates with ICE. Cops can lie to protest organizers and protesters. It is common and completely incorrect belief that they cannot, but they may promise one thing and do another. Permits do not make protesters safer. Even permitted protests have been targeted by police action where police have arrested protesters, destroyed protest equipment and medic supplies, and brutalized protesters. Some groups getting permits while others don't may pit groups against each other, with some being portrayed in the media as good and others as bad. Those who are perceived as bad for not being complicit in the limiting of their own human rights may be targets for more injustice that will be further excused because, well, why didn't they just pull a permit? Permitted protests have to be linked to a person's legal identity, which does not work for anonymized protests and makes it very easy for organizers to be identified and doxxed. So what about counter-protesters? On one hand, the government cannot use the expected reaction of other people as a justification to restrict a protest. But it also cannot restrict counter-protesters from expressing their own free speech either. They have just as much a right to protest your protest as you do to protest in the first place. Unfortunately, the government can require protesters to pay for insurance to cover damages to public property. However, the government can't place an undue burden on the protesters, and they have to reflect the actual costs and risks based on things like crowd sizes, and they cannot base the price on the protest message. They also cannot impose a larger financial burden on a protest because counter-protesters might oppose the message of the protest. The government can also enforce laws against violence, such as fighting with counter-protesters, as well as those against other crimes like vandalism and destruction of public property. Additionally, protesters have the right to destroy their own property, but not the property of counter-protesters. For example, a protester can burn a flag that they are carrying anywhere where fire is permitted, but they cannot take the flags of counter-protesters and burn them. The legalities of street medicine. Street medics, riot medics, and action medics fall into a strange state of legal exception. Most have no medical license and would not normally be legally allowed to treat a person in a medical crisis. In emergencies, special laws go into effect, referred to as Good Samaritan laws. In those cases of emergency, licensed physicians often cannot provide services on the street without special permission from the governing authorities, or they are at risk for losing their license. Although some doctors and nurses operate as street riot and action medics, either outside the bounds of the law or with special permission granted to them by the authorities, most street riot and action medics are not physicians or nurses. Rather, they have had more specialized training, such as wilderness first responder training, first aid training, or street riot protest action medicine training. The UN Convention for the Amelioration of the Condition of the Wounded and Sick in Armed Forces in the Field requires that there be mutual consent of both sides before a medic can serve. However, it is unclear if the zone of no protest, the phrase used in Seattle 1999, in which activists protest, qualifies as armed conflict or what laws remain to protect them. There are legal rules for what a Good Samaritan can and cannot do for those harmed in emergencies, although they can vary very much from state to state. The law offers protection only for people who have no duty to act, as in it is not part of their paid job description to provide care. A medic must not assist someone without their consent. A medic must not operate outside the bounds of their competence. If they are not trained for CPR, they must not provide CPR. If they are trained as a wilderness first responder, they can provide the level of care a wilderness first responder would normally provide, and they will be held to the standard of care that a wilderness first responder is trained to provide. The care provided must also always be free. The specifics of the laws vary from state to state. The Good Samaritan laws do not cover street, riot, protest, or action medics who give someone an over-the-counter drug like aspirin or Advil, dispense a prescription drug, administer another person's prescription medicine, commit gross negligence, willful harm, or abandonment. The Supreme Court of California recently allowed civil suits to continue against volunteer aid providers, aka the Good Samaritans, so a Good Samaritan may still be sued even if they acted to save a life. If a licensed medical professional does provide services as a riot, street, protest, or action medic, when legally permitted to do so, they must still follow HIPAA, and so any records generated must stay with the person assisted. Even if a person has extensive wilderness first responder or first aid training, it is my personal recommendation that they still attend a street, riot, protest, or action medic training course, and that their first few outings they operate under the auspices of a medic collective. A street, riot, protest, action medic operates under unique emergency environments that require specialized training. Next time we will get into organizational structures, the difference between collectives and affinity groups. To drive engagement with this video, I'm going to ask you all a question for you to answer in the comments. Do you believe that protesters should pull permits? Why or why not? Do you believe that requiring protests pull a permit violates our First Amendment rights? And do you believe that it supports the apparatus of oppression? Why or why not? If you were a protest organizer, would you insist that the protest pull a permit? If you are attending a protest, does it matter to you whether or not the protest organizers pulled a permit for the protest? Okay, answer that in the comments below. And please remember to like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, because we have more of this kind of content coming out at least weekly right now. As a reminder, you can find the full course for free on our Patreon at patreon.com/Sanctum of the Craft. It's in the public content. The written version, the live seminar version, and the downloadable EPUB and PDF are available for free. You can download them for free, and you can distribute them to your community if you feel moved to do so. And as always, stay safe out there, everyone.